USAID and State Department-funded democracy and governance programs be extended to the Gulf region as well, with a particular emphasis in that region on encouraging the equality of women. Thank you for allowing me and NDI to share these thoughts.
Thank you very much. And now we will hear from Ms. Abdel Karim. Thank you.
Madam Chairman, Acting Ranking Member Mr. Conley, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, on behalf of IFAS, I greatly appreciate the opportunity to share with you our Middle East and North Africa programs and discuss the greatest challenges to democracy in the region. IFAS work in the MENA region focuses on building the foundation that are essential to the development of civic culture and effective, resilient democratic institutions. With funding from USAID, MEPI, DRL, and international donors, we work with wide spectrum of local partners. This include the judiciary, the legislature, civil society, independent media, and the institutions responsible for managing the electoral processes. For example, in Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Libya, Tunis, and Yemen, IFAS has supported electoral processes such as boundary delimitation, voter education, voter registration, vote counting, and out-of-country voting. In Lebanon, Yemen, Morocco, Libya, and elsewhere, IFAS has assisted locally driven constitutional building and election reform efforts. IFAS has also worked on greater access to the political process for persons with disability, women, youth, and other marginalized groups in countries like Syria, Libya, Morocco, and Lebanon. Over the years, IFAS has increased its collaboration with government and regional organizations, including the League of the Arab States and the Organization for Election Management Bodies. We operate in extremely challenging environments where widespread and deeply rooted political unrest continue to persist. Factors that played a major role in the 2011 uprisings, such as unemployment, struggling economies, and inadequate access to justice and ineffective governance, are not sufficiently addressed. The breakdown in security and rising volatility caused by ongoing civil wars, the rise of extremist group, and foreign intervention are daunting factors that do not promise stabilizations or democratic developments in the short term. Despite these challenges, there is still a widespread desire for fundamental democratic ideals. And despite violent and ruthless suppression, the people of the MENA region have not surrendered their democratic aspirations. Unfortunately, U.S. assistance to democracy and governance programming in the region has declined. We must evaluate the way in which democracy is supported and sustained. Instead of short-term solution, the U.S. must aim for long-term democracy assistance strategy and continue to promote a broader notion of democratic governance that include tolerance, consensus and peace building, human rights protection, and capacity building for social and economic development. Our strategy should be grounded in realistic expectation about the pace and the course of change. We must leverage existing international framework, bilateral agreement, diplomacy, and development to cultivate great space for prosperity, peace, and security. U.S. support for fundamental rights and democratic norms must be unequivocal. Therefore, pressure must be maintained on governing elites to be responsive and accountable to their citizens, and to genuinely pursue democratic freedom, access to justice, and the rule of law, regardless of the governing system they choose to implement. Furthermore, democracy assistance must complement but not be eclipsed by counterterrorism efforts and military-to-military collaboration. We ask that the U.S. Congress to continue its support to democracy programming, especially when many countries in the region will likely see national and local election in 2018, including Egypt, Lebanon, Iraq, Tunis, and possibly Libya. Strengthening national institutions will help to make election more legitimate and responsive rather than destabilizing events. Last but not least, we continue to lean on Congress support for robust funding levels for democracy programs and encourage you to leverage your oversight role in ensuring appropriations are obligated and spent. With that, I end my remark and thank you, Madam Chairman, for the opportunity to testify, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much for coming. Dr. Herman.
Chairwoman Ros-Lehtinen and Acting Ranking Member Connolly and distinguished members of the subcommittee, on behalf of Freedom House, thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify here today. And more importantly, let me convey my organization's deep appreciation for the subcommittee's strong bipartisan support for democracy, human rights, and governance programming in the Middle East and North Africa. And Madam Chairwoman, your retirement after the current term ends will be a tremendous loss to our community. You've been a tireless and passionate advocate for this work. Let me also say how proud I am to be here with my esteemed colleagues from sister organizations like Freedom House, have the privilege of working with courageous and committed activists and dedicated public servants around the world, including in the MENA region, and doing so with the support of funding from the United States government. Our Freedom in the World reports have chronicled a decade-long decline in freedom, while a recent report, Breaking Down Democracy, unpacks the rise of modern authoritarianism that at its core is a systematic, sophisticated, collaborative, global assault on democratic institutions, norms, and values. The MENA region, among the world's most repressive, where only 1 in 20 people live in a country rated free by Freedom House, reflects this alarming trend. While it is unwise, as we've heard, to proclaim the Arab Spring a failure, especially as Tunisia struggles to build a democratic society, the MENA political landscape is grim. Between resilient, despotic regimes and countries engulfed in sectarian-driven conflict, people have little prospect of exercising their fundamental rights or organizing to bring about political change. Let me mention 3 interrelated impediments in the region. First, the closing of civic space is a strategy used by virtually every government in the region, often through the sharing of worst practices that prevent pro-democracy civil society to organize effectively to advance common interests. In countries such as Egypt, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia, the goal is to crush dissent entirely. The authoritarian regimes use subservient judicial and legislative bodies to lend a patina of legitimacy to their oppression. Stigmatization and vilification efforts using state-controlled mass media seek to undermine activist credibility with the population. Second, the dearth of accountability of the ruling elites to the citizens is a consequence of the concentration of power and the comparative weakness of civil society and of the suppression of independent media that prevents these critical institutions from performing their watchdog role. A culture of impunity can galvanize pro-reform sentiment, but it also can leave citizens disillusioned and feeling they have no agency to influence decisions that affect their lives. Third, the rise of violent extremist groups such as Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State stems in no small part, from the denial of fundamental freedoms and anachronistic political systems that fail to address the legitimate grievances and aspirations of citizens. MENA governments have used the genuine threat posed by these radical groups to crack down on peaceful political activity, frequently invoking anti-terrorism legislation to justify broad-based repression. Let me offer a few recommendations. First, Congress and the executive branch should work together to ensure that U.S. policy and strategy toward the MENA region emphasizes strengthening government accountability, protecting basic human rights, broadening political competition and participation. Democracy and human rights programs are much more likely to have impact if they reflect the overall U.S. policy priorities as well as our core principles and values. We must avoid the pernicious, false trade-off between security and stability on the one hand and respect for fundamental freedoms and democratic norms on the other. Giving a pass to allies and security partners that block democratic reform, systematically violate rights, and engage in large-scale corruption erodes our moral authority and contributes to conditions that can fuel radicalization, impeding our ability to advance our national interests. Second, democracy and human rights governance funding should focus primarily on civil society and established or nascent political parties as the most likely catalysts for non-violent political change. Providing support to state institutions makes sense only where there is demonstrated political will to undertake meaningful reforms. And at the same time, security assistance, a major source of U.S. government funding in the region, should be conditioned on would-be recipient government meeting a meaningful standard of human rights and democratic accountability. And if I can, just one more. The U.S. should work with like-minded governments to press across the MENA region on issues of corruption and impunity, a combination that has left citizens angry and disillusioned and undermine their confidence in governing institutions. Sanctions regimes such as the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act should be used whenever appropriate to hold accountable perpetrators of corruption and human rights violations. I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you.
Good recommendations from all of you. Thank you so much. I'll start with you, Mr. Mastic. The Lebanese Prime Minister's decision to resign over the weekend has a lot of people worried about the future of Lebanon, as well as increasing regional tensions between Iran, Saudi Arabia. With Lebanon's parliamentary elections scheduled for May of next year, it would seem that we should be ramping up our democracy and governance efforts to ensure that moderate parties aren't getting pushed to the side by Hezbollah. What kind of U.S.-funded democracy and governance efforts are you seeing in Lebanon right now? And are we prioritizing the democracy and governance aspect the way we should in advance of this election?
Thank you. I think what we've seen this weekend reflects the limitations of a notion of a national unity government when the main power player in that government is an illiberal, authoritarian movement that has compulsory force that it could utilize outside the bounds of state institutions. And so now we're sort of in a situation of limbo again about when and whether we'll proceed to parliamentary elections. My concern is that over the last several years, I've noted a pulling back from or reluctance with respect to U.S. assistance to support what I would consider to be key U.S. democratic allies in Lebanon. And I think in many instances it's because of this notion of trying to keep things in a stable situation and encouraging sort of a national unity approach. But really we've quickly reached a limitation on that given the nature of the dynamics within Lebanon and the presence of Hezbollah. So what I would hope to see now is a redoubling of efforts in supporting political actors in preparing for parliamentary elections, and specifically those that fall more in line with the interests and values of the United States.
Thank you so much. Ms. Abdel Karim, in your written testimony, you recommended that the U.S. should aim for a long-term democracy assistance strategy that is linked to counterterrorism deterrence. How does inconsistent democracy and governance assistance hurt us here in the United States? And if you could tell us, if the U.S. doesn't prioritize democracy and governance in the region and increase the public trust in the power of elections, what dangers do you see for democratic progress in that region?
Over the years, the U.S. have limited its support, I should say, been very selective in the countries that it decide to give support to. The post-Saddam period in Iraq have proven to be filled with human tragedy, including violence, political instability, and brewing civil war. The mistrust and the suspicions are very dominant features of the region perception of the United States. Therefore, a long-term strategy that focuses on providing support equally across the board to countries that are in dire need for our intervention and support will be key. Unfortunately, we will continue to be viewed as meddling in the politics and interfering to change the political order. The backlash against democracy aid is require a building of trust and a buy-in, and we seek to impose. We should not seek to impose ourselves, but in fact, seek to be invited to support. So,
Thank you.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. And lastly, Dr. Herman, in your written testimony, you highlight the degree of collaboration and active exporting of worst practices in the current wave of repressive rule. What are some of those examples of the worst practices that you've seen in the Middle East and North Africa region, and to what do you attribute this new collaboration?
Thanks. Well, in some ways, the Middle East was a latecomer to what I call the rise of modern authoritarianism. You've had certainly repressive, despotic governments in place for a long time, but this new phenomenon that we're seeing, which, as I said, is a little bit more sophisticated, many of these governments around the world, leading authoritarian states, whether it's Russia, China, and others, and now I would put Saudi Arabia and even Iran in that category. In most instances, what they have tried to do is stifle, or as I said, crush dissent, and doing that cynically in using laws for that purpose. So there's a patina of legitimacy. They think by using these institutions that have been compromised and is subservient to authoritarian power, in this case either to the royal rulers or to authoritarian governments, that's the way of doing it. And then there's an active effort to export these. And so what you'll see oftentimes is these metastasize like a cancer across the world. This is not just a passive diffusion of ideas. There's a as we say, an authoritarian playbook where people are meeting, discussing, and strategizing together. And part of the problem here is that the democratic governments in the world have been slow to recognize that, and I think to recognize the challenge that is posed by this more concerted effort.
Herman. Thank you so much, and I would like to ask Ambassador Wagner to take over chairing this subcommittee, because I have to go to the Intelligence Subcommittee. Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Hold
Thank
on a
you.
sec. Thank you so much. Please do.
Good. Yeah. All right, thank you. And we'll now turn to our ranking member, Mr. Connolly, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
I thank the chair. And to your point, Mr. Mastic, about Lebanon, I would note that in the previous administration, the budget for Lebanon was $213 million in foreign aid, mostly economic and democracy projects. This administration has cut that to $103 million, less than half. And I mentioned in my opening statement that the budget for democracy assistance in the region was cut by more than 40%, or would have been cut by more than 40% in the Trump budget request. So let me ask you, Mr. Campbell, and you, Mr. Mastic in particular, a 40% plus cut, does that affect your operations in the region, or can you just suck it up? Does it have substantive impact?
No, it has substantive impact, and in fact, I'd mentioned Lebanon. Maybe it'll be a big topic of discussion today. The numbers you gave, I'm sure they're exactly the case, but there has been no support for political party training or election support in Lebanon, even with the specter of an upcoming election. As Scott said, there's a lot to be done, and there has, up until now, been no support. There has been support for other democracy-type programs, which are that are good. I'm not criticizing them, but 40% across the region, which didn't happen, luckily, would have decimated our programs. Most of the programs that we described are very small. 500,000 I described. Some
Right.
State Department-funded programs, 300,000, 700. This is very little money, so a cut
Right.
like that would be devastating.
Mr. Mastic?
Yeah, so beyond the across-the-board decrease in the administration's request. I think it's more useful to look at how we are utilizing the money and the targets of opportunity for where we are
Yeah,
utilizing
but
it.
Mr. Mastic, that's not my question. My question is, would it affect your operations on the ground in the region if you had to absorb a 40% plus cut, if that's what this cut translated into?
It honestly depends on what countries we are utilizing the money in and where the cuts are. Because in the budget request that was given, in some instances there were increases in countries in this region. So it depends on where we are implementing programs and how that money.
Some countries more, some countries less, sure. I think it is important to know that with both IRI and NDI, it's not just your specific projects or programs on the ground, but there's a nexus that gets created by your presence. So there's an NGO nexus, there's a civic engagement nexus, there's even a business nexus attracted to this magnet of democracy building. And when you cut that or eliminate that or jeopardize that, lots of other things are affected in the ripple effects. I think you'd both agree.
Yes, that's
Let the
correct.
record show both agreed. Dr. Herman, should we be worried about Tunisia? Tunisia is often cited as the one example out of the Arab Spring that kind of went the right direction. And after the fall of Ben Ali, we see democratic institutions, we see multi-party participation, we see changes in society, and yet there seems to be some backsliding. I mean, the government indefinitely delayed long-planned local government elections, which really bothers somebody who comes from local government, who believes that's where the seed of democracy is planted. And then the resignation of the National Election Commission leadership, largely due to political influence, we think. Is Tunisia in trouble? Is our hope for Tunisia perhaps illusory?
I don't think it's illusory, but if there's a lesson that we can learn from what we've seen elsewhere around the world, that even consolidated democratic countries can experience backsliding, as we've seen in many places. And so if there's a lesson there, you can never take for granted. And those are in consolidated democratic societies, which which Tunisia certainly is not. So yes, there's been tremendous progress, but in order to keep going, yes, I think we should be concerned. What happens in Tunisia, a small country with outsized influence in the region, because it's absolutely critical that there is success in Tunisia in terms of moving forward for democracy, because they'll be a beacon in the region. So the answer is yes.
I couldn't agree. All right, I'm sorry. I'm running out of time. That's why
Yes.
I'm cutting you off. I couldn't agree with you more, but let me just cite, since I'm kind of fixed on these Trump budget numbers, the Trump budget would have cut democracy assistance to Tunisia almost in half. Would that be helpful?
No, I don't see that it'd be helpful if there's fewer resources. Of course, it depends what kind of programming they're going to and the rest, but no, of course. Resources in the case of an instance like Tunisia, absolutely critical. But so is U.S. policy to make sure that they are doing everything we can to support them in their effort to move forward democratically.
All right. In the interest of time, let me move on to another subject. I met with representatives of a lot of the people at this table and others, young, bright, idealistic Egyptians in Cairo a few years ago, and they were under arrest under the previous government, and they haven't been treated much better under this government, under el-Sisi. We talk about democracy building and so forth. There was a lot of rationalizing about the coup that overthrew the previous elected government, even though we didn't like the fact it was a Muslim Brotherhood government, and we replaced it with a government that mowed down 817 men, women, and children in one of the deadliest mass killings by a government in recent times, and a constant crackdown on democratic institutions. What is the status of especially local Egyptians who participated with us? I have been very concerned that we never give the signal that we care more about the American employees than we do about our local, because they put their lives on the line. And I just wonder, in the time left, if the two of you particularly would comment, and I don't know whether Dr. Herman has commented well. Where are we in Egypt with our locals who have put themselves on the line for democracy building?
Thank you for that question. I'll start and be brief. There is no change in status since the June 2013 convictions of our organization, NDI, Freedom House, and 2 other organizations in Egypt. So 43 persons were implicated in that trial, commonly known as the NGO trial. As of now, they remain in the same sort of situation or status since that conviction, which is convicted to 5 years in prison with hard labor. Thankfully, no one is actually in prison because they were convicted in absentia. The thing I would add, I think, is that the case itself that was utilized to put these persons on trial remains open, and so it is continuing to be used in going after Egyptian NGOs primarily now. And so that is, it's not only is our situation not resolved, but the case itself is utilized to continue to go after Egyptian NGOs.
If I can add just something briefly, a fact that probably most don't know is that of the 43 people that were convicted in what are called the NGO trials, the vast majority were non-American. 14 were American, the rest were Egyptian and other nationalities, most of them Egyptian. Appeals were filed on behalf of those employees. The appeals have never been brought forward by the Egyptian courts or heard. So the Egyptians are purposely keeping the whole thing in limbo, basically as a message to sort of back off NGOs and civil society. So it's still very much a going concern.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for your indulgence, and thank you.
I thank the gentleman. His time has expired, and I'm pleased to take over the chairmanship of this subcommittee at this time while our chair, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, is in Intel. And I want to thank you all for being here today. Beyond critical national security concerns, promoting democracy and human rights is the most important objective of American diplomacy and aid. I appreciate the work that your organizations do in advancing American values across the world, and I'm grateful that you made time to be here today. I would agree with Mr. Mastic that the lack of democracy and the prevalence of poor governance cause conflict across the Middle East and in North Africa. Fragile, failing, and authoritarian states pose serious political and security dilemmas, and it is very difficult for civil societies to make their voices heard in the MENA region. Mr. Mastic, you wrote that advancing women's empowerment is an important step in promoting democratic gains in the Middle East. To you and perhaps to Ms. Abdul Karim, what progress or obstacles have your organization seen on the ground regarding women's empowerment issues and allowing women to play a meaningful role in Middle East governments? Mr. Mastic.
Thank you. Well, for one thing, I think it's important that we sort of acknowledge or cite gains when they occur, and a couple of important things have happened recently, including very forward-leaning violence against women legislation that has passed in Tunisia, some changes in Jordan and Lebanon with respect to inheritance rights. So those kind of things matter, I think, and are some positive signs about how there is social change occurring in the region. With respect to the obstacles, though, of course, there remains sort of like deeply embedded social, cultural obstacles to the idea of women's leadership in the public space. And in many instances, women are sort of sidelined from having a seat at the table, especially on things that sort of extend beyond the realm of what people consider to be women's issues in the region. So part of our strategy has been to try to empower women as leaders in every sphere, every sector, and including sort of like economic issues, on defense and security issues, on various types of political leadership and thought.
Good. Ms. Abdul Karim, could you please comment, please?
Sure. If we looked across the region, the legal frameworks for election across the board continue to improve to increase the women political participation. However, it is very limited, and political parties continue to push for male candidates, knowing that the likelihood of them securing a certain constituency would be more possible on these if they run with male candidates. Nonetheless, progress is happening slowly. We, just recently, from the meetings that I had in Lebanon, to answer to Mr. Issa, it was shocking to us to see that the election law that was passed earlier this year have no quota or reserve seats for women. And it leave it fully for the political parties to determine, the ranking of the women in their lists. That indeed going to limited the number of women that are going to be selected for the next parliament. And also, we've seen countries like Egypt eliminated quotas that they had in the past. Despite these limitations, we see improvement on the women movements and advocacy, greater than it used to be.
I have limited time, Ms. Abdelkarim. You also wrote about the IFAS Civil Engagement Platform
Yes.
that focuses on Syrians who are now living in Turkey. One piece of that was the Women's Forum. Can you discuss how the Women's Forum operates and what its goals are?
Okay. The Women Forum is basically a group of women that we engage with through our local civil society groups. We're keen on building their capacity to ensure that they would play an effective role in advocating for the rights, especially when the time comes for looking into putting the legal framework for the country in the future. We also ensure that they have safe haven for exchanging, ideas, information that they could, advocate more effectively through the leaderships of the oppositions that are leading the conversations in Turkey and Gaziantep.
I thank you. Dr. Herman, I've run out of time. I'm so appreciative of Freedom House's work in the civic space, and I wonder if in writing you could respond to how can USAID and the State Department, sir, better include and aid civil society participation in some of these conflict zones. With that, my time has expired, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, for 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm terribly sorry. I'm sorry. The chair now
We're still here.
How could I miss you, Mr. Connolly? Yes, yes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Sicilian, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you again to our panelists. Dr. Herman, I want to start with you. When President Trump takes high-profile meetings with leaders like President Sisi of Egypt, President Erdogan of Turkey, and King Salman in Saudi Arabia, and fails to bring up issues of human rights or democratic governance, what message does that send to the region, both to the people and to other leaders? And in your experience, has there been any shift in perception on the part of regional leaders in terms of U.S. expectations in regards to the protection of human rights since President Trump took office as a result of both his statements and the failure to raise these issues in high-level meetings?
Thank you for that question. I know we talk a lot about programs and funding that goes to programs that we implement, but sometimes these, and they're not just symbolic, but the meetings that leaders have, I would say, that our leaders have with their counterparts, it's absolutely critical that these issues be raised. It sends the right signal both to those governments that this is something that is absolutely essential to American values and all this, but it also sends a very hopeful message to the activists on the ground who are putting their lives on the line, that we have their back, that we are supporting the work that they are doing. We're raising this. We're raising these issues with those governments. Absolutely critical. It's not a substitute for programs. It's not a substitute for good policy, but it has to be, and we should encourage our ambassadors and others to do that, assuming that is something that, given the crackdown we're seeing on civil society, that embrace is not going to be counterproductive.
But I guess my question is, knowing that, have you seen a shift in perception in the region by this administration and this president in particular, his failure to raise those very issues in those high-level meetings?
I think there is a lot of concern that the U.S. is both, I would say, even more broadly, is retreating from its global leadership role, but also how that then redounds to the country level and not raising it as much. Yes.
Thank you. And Mr. Campbell, just to follow up on Egypt for a moment, how would the newly proposed NGO law impact civil society and media organizations in Egypt? And with the imposition of this law, would the United States be able to maintain foreign assistance on these issues to Egypt and still be in compliance with the Brownback Amendment, which of course states that foreign governments may not control our democracy assistance?
Well, the new law, well, first of all, the new law codifies what was really happening under the old law, which is that unless the Egyptian government agreed with your program, you weren't going to get a registration, is the basic idea. You run the programs by them first, get full agreement, and of course, if you did that, that meant for sure that you wouldn't be meeting with anyone that was remotely opposition, you wouldn't be dealing with civil society organizations that were human rights oriented, et cetera. In my opinion, I'm not a lawyer and I don't study this, but I think just the fact that it is required to have your program run by the authorities first for their approval would run afoul of the Brownback Amendment. It seems quite obvious. And the other problem with the law is that it's so unclear as to how you can appeal things or move things forward that it allows the Egyptian government to leave NGOs in limbo and inevitably they get in trouble because they don't know what's allowed and what's not allowed.
And I don't know, I would just ask this next question. With almost a dozen Saudi royals reported arrested over the past couple of days for what has been described as corruption, it naturally raises the question of what legal system is in place in Saudi Arabia to even charge officials with corruption. Can anyone on the panel shed any light on this?
I don't know specifically in the Saudi case, but we can't pretend that these countries and these governments are rule of law. It's the rule by law, not the rule of law. So the idea that we go through this, and I don't know what's happening there, but we've seen this time and time again that anti-corruption laws are used to go after one's political opponents rather than really address the root causes of the corruption. I don't know if that's the case.
Mr. Mastic, we look at your...
So it's always a sort of a challenge to understand the timing and motivations behind certain things that happen within the Saudi kingdom, especially when it relates to the royal family, right? The one thing I would say is simply, what we have noted is that there is widespread concern and public dissatisfaction across the region. We've seen this in opinion polling and other places about the issue of corruption. It is a palpable issue that is undermining the legitimacy of government and leadership. And so, in many ways, not fully knowing the motivation, one sort of understands that it could occur at this time, and that that is responsive, I would argue, to certain things that are going on in the kingdom.
Thank you. I just asked, Madam Chair, I know my time has run out, but I'd ask the members of the panel if they could provide a written answer describing the situation for LGBT individuals generally throughout the region. We talk a lot in this committee about the targeting of LGBT individuals by ISIS, which is horrific, but the truth is that the entire region, with the exception of Israel, is a very harsh and even dangerous climate for those who seek to protect the rights of LGBT individuals. So I'd love to hear from the panel in as much detail as you can on the current situation. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Isas, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. He can live up to my promise on Lebanon, but Dr. Herman, to paraphrase a statement from Casablanca, are you shocked there'd be corruption in Saudi Arabia? No.
No, of course not.
Okay, so the possibility, in addition to all the other possibility, is that in Saudi Arabia, corruption by high-ranking people in the government / royal family certainly was possible.
No question. No question, yes.
I look forward to seeing it. Similarly, the statements that have been made about Lebanon, that Lebanon's corruption, if you will, was rising very quickly. Ma'am, you're shaking your head yes. Would you seem to be aware of the challenges going on over these last couple of years in Lebanon, specifically in the area of corruption, and then I want to get into election law.
Sure. Concerns are rising, for example, on the procurements for the elections. That's where I shook my head. There's concern that the procurement processes that the government take are not open and transparent, and they lean towards sole sourcing of certain, businesses. So I totally agree, and that concern is widely spread among, the stakeholders.
Yeah. Now, briefly, the change in the election law in Lebanon, which is one of the subjects of concern for the two democracy organizers, if you will. This election, the election law in Lebanon has worked for many, many years, as flawed as it is. The new election law, would you fairly characterize it as a form of gerrymandering? Not that the old one wasn't.
Yes.
You know, I'll start on this. It's, first of all, the old election law had, to say it had flaws, I think is an understatement, because there were no written ballots. And the fact that a person could bring in a blank piece of paper of their own, any kind of paper, and write in the name of the candidate, without question led to all sorts of voter fraud. And so,
Oh yeah, it was practically like Chicago.
no question. Yeah. The new law, yes, I mean, I've received information that show that it would probably favor perhaps one side over the other. However, it was agreed to. It was there were improvements in the law. What I was hoping was that we would have a debate about the law and have improvements prior to the election. I mean, the fact that it seems, as Scott mentioned earlier,
Is there still time for that? Assuming, for example, that Lebanon recognizes that our aid and our support is going to be contingent on free and fair elections, including a fair allocation of, if you will, district, because it's a district-based system, it holds open the possibility that you draw the lines, you draw the results.
there is time, and I think that there is a debate. There's an open debate. I think you have, with General Aoun as president, you've got some parts of the Lebanese community, particularly the Christian community, thinking that that they'll get more fair representation. There have been analyses that show that Hezbollah and their allies might, be favored by the election law. I think it's an ongoing debate. There's more than enough time to change it. The shame of this whole situation would be, in my opinion, if a parliament which was last elected in 2009 and has really lost any kind of momentum or legitimacy ends up being a casualty of this. People are desperate in Lebanon, as you know, for change and some forward momentum.
There. Briefly, because I want to follow up on Egypt. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
sure. I do think there's time. One of the things I'll say about an advantage with the election law change is I think it provided some opportunity for new independent voices and actors to come into the electoral competition space. And that's positive in the sense that it is generating more dynamism in the political debate. And so with any change, if there's additional change, I would hope that it at least sort of preserves a system that allows for new independent movements and actors to sort of come into the electoral competition.
Well, and that's something that I think we in the United States would assume that we favor in a parliamentary system. But let me switch to Egypt for a moment. You were involved in that. I'll note Mr. LaHood's presence as one of the individuals caught up in that challenge. We had full access in Egypt. We were allowed to, both of your organizations were allowed to freely operate in Egypt, and you had years of building, if you will, these political organizations, mostly intellectuals who formed, if you will, third parties, and yet it collapsed and collapsed fully when the Muslim Brotherhood came in and swept the election and doesn't exist today. So my question to you, with the time the Chair might give me, if we had that opportunity in Egypt again, how would we do it differently so that those programs would yield real political organizations that had staying power to actually have an effect? Because we had the opportunity, we had years, Hosni Mubarak gave us those years, and it did us no good when those elections occurred, in my opinion.
So I think some of the response on what we do differently is about implementation. Some of it, frankly, is at a higher policy level with respect to, for example, what the U.S. State Department and through our embassy is saying to the Egyptian leadership, sort of irrespective of who that is. On the implementation side, I do think that a greater focus on sort of leveling the political landscape between competitors would have been helpful for the electoral competition element. I don't know that any programming would have, say, produced a different outcome in the first election because of the dynamic of the Muslim Brotherhood entering the electoral competition for the first time. I do think that there could have been much more vocal policy rhetoric with respect to a Democratic backslide once the Muslim Brotherhood was elected and the way Morsi governed, and a more redoubled effort on helping new political entrants and building new parties.
Gentleman's time's expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank all of you for your testimony. And so let me pick up there, Mr. Mastic. No, actually, you're right, Madam Chair. You're right. And so, Mr. Mastic, let me pick up there because we keep talking about the Muslim Brotherhood. We talk about Hezbollah. We talk about Hamas and their infiltration into the election process as a legitimate party. And yet, Dr. Herman was talking about it not being the rule of law, but I guess ruling by law. And what happens is with the State Department's inability to acknowledge maybe the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, it sends a conflicting message as if it is what in the West we would think is just a legitimate party with a different focus. Do you not see that we send conflicting messages as it relates to some of this, whether it be in Egypt or whether it be in Lebanon with Hezbollah? Are we sending conflicting messages?
I think one of the challenges about this is Islamism encompasses a huge range of actors and perspectives. And just one data point I would offer is in Tunisia the Islamist party is actually working in a coalition government with the primary secular party and has proven to be very prudent in the way that it has approached the democratic transition.
So what would be what is the difference? Because I agree, and if you look at Tunisia, you can look at some, from a coalition standpoint, a very positive direction that we're seeing. So what is the difference? What is it? When does it slip from an ideological point of view to what I would say an activist point of view that has a very different outcome?
Yeah, well, I think one of the key differences in what we saw in Egypt is that the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood proved to be a highly authoritarian, illiberal actor once it was elected to power.
So why didn't we condemn that more vociferously than we did?
Those would be questions that you would have to pose to the
well, then why
decision makers at the time.
Well, then my question comes to this administration because largely we're silent on that too. This is not a Democrat or Republican. We have been silent on it. And at what point are we going to start to speak out about what is legitimate and what is not, instead of pretending that somehow we ignore the obvious? And we're seeing it play out right now in Lebanon in a different way, but because we've been ignoring it and it's been relatively peaceful in Lebanon, we ignore the presence of Hezbollah and their influence in the region.
Right. And ironically, of course, Hezbollah is a designated foreign terrorist organization under U.S. law. So I think the best response I could try to give here is simply that part of it is looking at the actual ideology and behavior, actions of the group, and part of it gets into a realm that is far outside of sort of my knowledge, which is financing and where the support comes from. Persons over at the Department of Treasury are sort of best to deal with that.
Listen, but this is different, and let's look at Muslim Brotherhood specifically, because this is very different. I was an author of the Hezbollah, sanctioning bill, so I get the financial side of it. But what you're dealing with is not finances. What you're dealing with is democracy, and it has nothing to do with the finances. And until we start to actually articulate our concerns, you're going to have these abnormal issues that we've got to address. The gentleman from Virginia was talking about funding. Listen, I've been one that has advocated on funding on your behalf from a foreign policy standpoint. But if you're going to be anemic with proper assessment, there's no sense to have you around. And I'm saying, coordinating that with the State Department, the message needs to be clear. It is time that we start acknowledging the obvious. Wouldn't you agree, Mr. Campbell?
Yeah, I agree in most senses. One of the things that I think we need to do is make sure that, that parties that have not renounced violence or that have violent wings aren't treated as just normal competitors in elections, which is,
Thank you. And I think that that's exactly where we need to go with this, because here's what I have been troubled with, is that at times, listen, we're all about freedom, and we're all about free speech, and we're all about a competition of ideas. But the minute that you start putting in the violence that is accompanied with that, you miss out. Wouldn't you agree, Dr. Herman?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that's the critical point, that these parties have to be committed to peaceful participation, peaceful processes. And I would also say, though, that we should also be spending time worrying about and trying to find out why are so many people in those societies drawn to those who would not renounce violence as a way of bringing about political change. And that goes back to the idea of inclusion and giving people an ability to participate in a political system that they can change it without resort to violence.
Well, and that is, as our democracy would say, is protecting the rights of the minority. And when you do that, it has good results. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Just going back to the last answer, and I want to first of all apologize for being here a little late. I had a small business hearing and a judiciary hearing, and so I've missed much of what's happened. So if I'm repeating anything that's already been said, tough luck. No, I'm sorry. I apologize. But going back to why are people drawn to kind of violent ideologies, Dr. Herman, if I could go to you with that, and anybody that would like to answer for that matter. And that certainly seems to be the case in some of the recent history that we've seen, particularly in the Middle East. The previous administration, pulled out of Iraq, and I'd been there, a number of times. And when we were talking to our military personnel there, our Iraqi counterparts, to virtually anybody, there was always this concept that a certain level of troops would be left there for a period of time, anywhere from 10,000 to 15 to 20,000 or so. And ultimately, that's not what happened, and I would argue that we saw the results of that, which was the rise of ISIS, and the country, which I think probably Baghdad would have fallen had the administration and our allies in the region not finally stepped forward and did something. They didn't do enough, and it took far too long, but ultimately we see, recently ISIS is falling, although, they're like rats. They go into other parts of the region, and they're going to have mischief is too weak a word. There's going to be horrific action as a result of their being all over the place. But the point is, when we pulled out, it didn't take too long for Iraq to fall. If we pulled our troops out of Afghanistan, the administration is not considering that, I don't believe, but if we did, because a lot of Americans, I think, we're tired, but we've been there for a long, long time. We still are losing our men and women there. If we pulled out, how long would it take for the Taliban to take over? Anybody that would like to take that?
Well, regrettably, the Taliban already controls portions of the country. I don't know that they have the capability to sort of take over Kabul in the sense of a kind of full takeover of the country, in part because of the efforts that have been put into sort of like building resiliency. But the writ of the government of Afghanistan kind of ends at the Kabul city limits, unfortunately. Right. And so how long could they kind of withstand that growing onslaught? It's hard for me to offer a timeline on that, but certainly if there is a minimized U.S. presence, efforts to ensure that doesn't happen are important, certainly.
Right. Thank you. I think as distasteful as it is that we have to, it seems like, leave our men and women in harm's way in that region longer than a lot of us thought we would be there or should be there. I think the adverse consequences of pulling them out would be tragic and horrific, and we can't afford to do that. Let me shift gears completely. I don't have a whole lot of time left, and I'm assuming you all already talked about this to some degree, but who would like to comment on Prince Mohammed bin Salman's recent aggressive diplomatic tactics and what is going on there, and what should we think about that? Mr. Campbell, I think I see you ready to
Yeah, no, I'm
chomping
glad.
at the bit. So.
Yeah, we did talk about it a little bit, but I think we all agreed that no one knows the inner workings of Saudi Arabia well enough. But just to make a comment, Yemen is such a volatile place right now, and there's a lot of saber rattling coming out of Saudi Arabia. Prime Minister Hariri, left Lebanon, went to Saudi Arabia, then resigned, and then we had the sacking of the various princes and putting them in the Ritz-Carlton and so on. I don't know the inner workings. We were saying earlier that perhaps this is an anti-corruption move, but I would wonder if there's anyone in Saudi Arabia in the higher echelon of the princes that's not corrupt. So it's a little hard for me to believe that one group is not corrupt, all the other group is corrupt. But what really worries me more than anything is that at this moment, when the region is so sensitive and at this tender moment in terms of all-out warfare, even worse than what we have, Saudi Arabia appears to want to start wars. And I don't know if they are going to fight the wars because they haven't fought it very well in Yemen. Yeah. They started and they haven't been able to finish it. They've created a crisis there. So my only comment on that, not knowing the inner workings, is the way they're talking is not helpful.
Thank you. And my time's expired, but I would just, if I could, have one final comment. I think there ought to be considerable concern when one considers the rise of Iran in the region and the negative consequences of what they've wrought thus far, and to think that the Saudis could be unstable at this critical time is of, I think, considerable concern, or ought to be. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. And now the chair finally gets to recognize a gentleman with good patience, a gentleman from California, who is the chair of the Europe Subcommittee, a gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed this hearing. Thank you very much for stimulating the discussion. As I say, I went through this when our number one enemy was the Soviet Union and communism was the great threat. And I don't know, maybe people don't agree with me now, but radical Islamic terrorists, and as I say, when radical Islam gets in charge of a government, they become radical Islamic fascists, have a fascist system, is the number one threat to the free people of the world. And I would hope that as we get into this battle, that we are not making a mistake that peaceful change is the only way that happens in the world. We understand there are people fighting one another who are not perfect people, but good intentions and more people who more reflect what we would want them to do if they don't come to power, and no matter what their good intentions are, if who comes to power are these radical Islamic terrorists, then we have failed. Then we are making it a worse world by trying to be perfectionists. And all the criticism I've heard of Egypt right now, I will just have to tell you, if I happen to believe that Morsi, there was an election after Morsi was removed, all right, I understand that Morsi was removed. That was a coup of d'etat, and there was an election since then. However, if General Sisi and his government fall, does anyone here think that Christians will be more protected? And if Morsi would have stayed in, would Christians in Egypt be worse off? Or how about these other minorities that we're talking about? Would Egypt be a freer society now? And I will tell you, if Egypt falls, the El-Sisi government would fall to a radical Islamic group, the whole Middle East would go into turmoil, and chances of freedom would be less. So no matter how good people's intentions are, no matter how moral we can position ourselves, if the outcome is more radical Islamic governments, we have failed. And I happen to believe, yes, we should try to steer Egypt in the right direction, but we should not focusing on Egypt when there are so many other governments there that are worse and would murder Christians if they had a chance. And I don't believe that is true of General Sisi and his group that now are in control of Egypt. And no matter how we can proclaim through civil, your whole civil society movement, we can proclaim how we want minority groups who have different sexual preferences to be protected, or environmental ideas, or rights of women. If we indeed insist on that in imperfect governments, and we end up with radical Islamic governments, we have failed. We are taking the world in a worse direction. And I see that perfectionism leading to a world that's going to be less free, and especially in terms of the criticism I've heard today of Egypt. Let me ask you this, the panel, just very quickly. Do you consider the Muslim Brotherhood a democratic force and a positive force just in the Middle East, yes or no?
In Egypt, no.
No, all throughout the Middle East.
I am concerned about the authoritarian, illiberal nature of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Okay, so the answer is it is not. You say no on Muslim. How about you? Muslim Brotherhood, positive force, negative force.
Positive, negative force. I think, I don't know
Negative
if
force. I want to make
yeah,
sure everybody's
I don't think yes or
opinion
no.
gets on that.
But can I just,
Negative or positive?
It's a political party that must have the space to compete elections like any other political party.
I didn't catch that. Yes or no? Is it a negative or positive force in the Middle East?
I cannot categorize it.
Okay, you
positive
can't
or-
do that.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
that's really too bad. It tells a lot about you. Is it a positive or negative force?
To the extent that they're prepared to renounce violence as a way of gaining political support, I would say they could be a positive force, but I share Scott's very much his analysis that as we see it now, no. And of course, in Egypt, the best outcome would have been for them to be just not gone in a coup, but voted out of office and then inoculate the citizenry from thinking that that's a solution to the
Well,
problems of
the
Egypt.
Muslim Brotherhood gives excuses for people to tyrannize other human beings, and exactly the thing your civil society claims to be against. And the world isn't just changed by violence; it's changed by people who propagate ideas that will lead to tyranny and to violence. The Muslim Brotherhood is a negative force in the world, and especially in the Middle East. And we better start being realistic, or we're going to have a totally destabilized world where radical Islamic terrorists have a lot more threat to everybody else in the world than they have today. Thank you very much, Madam Chairman.
Gentlemen, time's expired, and without further ado, the Middle East and North African Subcommittee hearing on democracy and governments in the Middle East and North Africa stands adjourned.
He cannot ask that question simply.
Yes or no?